I never thought I would be sitting in my parents' living room telling people this story. 3 years ago, if someone had told me that I would one day thank God for rescuing me from the darkest season of my life, I would have laughed in their face. Not because I hated God, not because I thought Christianity was foolish, but because I had spent years running from him. And I genuinely believed I didn't need him. My name is Andriana Johnson. I am 25 years old, and I grew up in London, England. What I'm about to tell you is completely true. It is the story of how I spent years chasing everything I thought would make me happy, and how I nearly lost myself in the process. Most importantly, it is the story of the day I finally stopped running from God. Even now, thinking back to that night still makes my heart race. The rain was hitting my apartment windows. The city lights outside looked blurry through the storm. My phone was almost out of battery, and I was sitting on the cold kitchen floor crying harder than I had ever cried before. I felt completely broken, completely lost, completely alone. For the first time in years, I looked up toward the ceiling and whispered 5 words. God, please help me. At that moment, I had no idea that prayer would change everything. But to understand why those words mattered so much, you need to understand who I used to be. Because from the outside, my life looked perfect. I was raised in a loving family in South London. My father worked as an accountant, my mother was a teacher. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Enough food, enough laughter, enough love, and every Sunday morning, without fail, we attended church. As a child, I actually enjoyed it. I loved the music, I loved the Christmas programs, I loved seeing my friends. Back then, faith felt simple. God was real. Life made sense. And I never imagined I would one day walk away from it all. But things began changing when I entered my teenage years. Questions started appearing in my mind, questions that made me uncomfortable. Why do innocent people suffer? Why do children die from diseases? Why do terrible things happen if God loves us? Why do some prayers seem unanswered? I asked pastors, I asked youth leaders, I asked Christian friends. Many of them tried to help, but I still felt unsatisfied. Slowly, doubt began replacing certainty. The older I became, the less interested I was in faith. By the time I turned 18, I had already decided that religion was something people used when they couldn't handle reality. I wanted facts, I wanted independence, I wanted control over my own life. And honestly, I didn't think I needed God for any of that. When I left home for university, I felt free. No parents reminding me about church, no discussions about faith, no expectations. For the first time, I could build my own life exactly the way I wanted, and that's exactly what I did. I threw myself into university life, parties, friends, social events, weekend trips, late-night adventures. Everyone seemed excited about the future. Everyone seemed confident. Everyone looked happy. I wanted that happiness too, so I chased it. I chased experiences. I chased success. I chased popularity. I chased attention. And for a while, I genuinely believed I had found what I was looking for. But looking back now, I realized something. The things I thought would satisfy me only distracted me. They never fulfilled me. The feeling of excitement always faded. The happiness never lasted. And every time I reached a goal, another empty space appeared inside me. At first, I ignored it. Most young people feel uncertain sometimes. At least that's what I told myself. But after graduating and landing a job with a marketing company in central London, that emptiness became impossible to ignore. This was supposed to be the beginning of my dream life. The salary was good. The office was modern. The opportunities were exciting. My social media looked amazing. Friends congratulated me constantly. Family members told me how proud they were. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But behind closed doors, I was struggling. Every morning I woke up exhausted. Every evening I felt drained. I constantly worried about making mistakes. I worried about my future. I worried about my career. I worried about money. I worried about relationships. I worried about things that hadn't even happened. The strange thing was that I couldn't explain why. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Yet anxiety seemed to follow me everywhere. Like a shadow I couldn't escape. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, answering emails when it happened. Without warning, my heart started racing. My chest tightened, my hands began shaking. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe properly. The room felt smaller. My vision blurred. I genuinely thought I was dying. Colleagues rushed over. Someone called emergency services. Within minutes, I was being taken to hospital. I was terrified, convinced something was seriously wrong. Hours later, after multiple tests, a doctor entered the room. He looked at me calmly. Then he delivered news I never expected. "There is nothing physically wrong with your heart." I stared at him, confused. "What happened then?" He paused. "You experienced a panic attack." A panic attack. Those words sounded almost ridiculous. How could anxiety make me feel like I was dying? The doctor explained how stress can affect the body, how fear can trigger powerful physical reactions, how panic attacks often feel like heart attacks. I listened carefully, but inside, I felt frightened. Because if my own mind could do that once, what would stop it from happening again? Unfortunately, nothing did. Over the next several months, the attacks became more frequent. Sometimes they happened on trains, sometimes in crowded shopping centers, sometimes during meetings, sometimes while I was sitting alone doing absolutely nothing. The unpredictability terrified me. Soon, I wasn't just afraid of panic attacks. I became afraid of life itself. I stopped going places. I avoided social events. I turned down invitations. I isolated myself. The confident woman everyone knew slowly disappeared. Meanwhile, social media made everything worse. Every day I watched people posting perfect photos, perfect relationships, perfect holidays, perfect careers, perfect lives. Everyone looked happy except me. Everyone looked successful except me. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Meanwhile, I felt completely lost. The comparison became exhausting. No matter what I achieved, it never felt enough. No matter how hard I worked, I never felt satisfied. No matter how much success I experienced, the emptiness remained. It followed me into every room, every relationship, every achievement, every celebration. And eventually, I could no longer pretend everything was fine. One evening after work, I returned to my apartment and collapsed onto the sofa. The silence felt unbearable. No messages, no visitors, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. For the first time in years, I admitted something to myself. I wasn't happy, not even close. In fact, I was miserable. The life I had spent years building wasn't giving me the peace I expected. Instead, I felt trapped. That realization scared me more than any panic attack. Because if success couldn't satisfy me, then what could? That night, I opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for entertainment. I wasn't looking for work. I was looking for answers. Real answers. I typed a simple question into a search engine. How do you find peace? Thousands of results appeared. Articles, videos, podcasts, advice from psychologists, advice from influencers, advice from strangers. For hours I searched, for hours I read, for hours I watched, yet nothing truly reached the emptiness inside me. Then I noticed a video. Its title immediately caught my attention. I tried everything except God. Normally, I would have ignored something like that, but for some reason I clicked. A young woman began sharing her testimony. She talked about anxiety, fear, loneliness, depression, hopelessness. And the more she spoke, the more I felt like she was describing my own life. Then she said something I couldn't stop thinking about. She looked directly into the camera and said, "You can run from God for years, but you will never outrun His love." The words hit me harder than I expected. I immediately closed the video. I told myself it was emotional nonsense, religious exaggeration, wishful thinking. Yet somehow, those words stayed with me for days, then weeks. And deep inside, a question I had spent years avoiding slowly began to surface. What if God had never stopped looking for me? What if the emptiness I felt wasn't something success could fill? What if the peace I was searching for wasn't found in achievements at all? At the time, I didn't know it, but my life was about to change forever. Because a storm was coming, a storm that would strip away every illusion I had built. And on one rainy night in London, when I reached the very end of myself, I would finally discover that God had been closer than I ever imagined. For weeks after watching that video, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just an emotional story. Nothing more. People believe all kinds of things when they're hurting. That's what I kept telling myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had been awakened. The questions I had buried years earlier were coming back, and this time they were louder. Every morning on my way to work, I found myself thinking about God. Every evening before bed, I caught myself wondering whether there was more to life than what I could see. I didn't like it. In fact, it frustrated me. because I had spent years convincing myself that faith belonged in my past. Yet somehow, it kept finding its way back into my thoughts. Around the same time, things at work became even more stressful. Our company landed a major project. Everyone was expected to give everything they had. Long hours became normal, weekends disappeared. The pressure was relentless. I pushed myself harder than ever. I wanted to prove myself. I wanted recognition. I wanted success. But the harder I worked, the worse I felt. Sleep became difficult. Some nights I lay awake until 3 or 4 in the morning. My mind never stopped racing. Even when I was exhausted, I couldn't rest. I would stare at the ceiling, thinking about deadlines, mistakes, future plans, and worst-case scenarios. The anxiety was no longer occasional. It was constant, like background noise that never turned off. Then came one of the worst weeks of my life. It started with a mistake at work. A report I had prepared contained incorrect figures. The error wasn't entirely my fault. Several people had reviewed it, but I blamed myself anyway. For days, I replayed the situation in my mind, over and over again. Meanwhile, a relationship I had invested years into was also falling apart. The man I thought I might eventually marry had become distant. Our conversations felt forced. The connection we once had seemed to be disappearing. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to face it. Then one evening, after weeks of tension, he finally said the words I had been dreading. "I don't think this is working anymore." I remember staring at him, unable to speak, unable to process what I was hearing. Just like that, it was over. 3 years together. Gone. When I walked back to my apartment that night, London felt colder than I had ever experienced. The streets were crowded, cars rushed past, people laughed outside restaurants, life continued as normal. Yet it felt like my world had stopped. The moment I closed my apartment door behind me, I broke down. I cried until my chest hurt. I cried until my eyes burned. I cried because the future I had imagined no longer existed. And beneath the heartbreak was something even deeper. A crushing sense of emptiness. Because if I was honest, the relationship hadn't been the real source of my pain. It had only been covering it. The loneliness had already been there. The fear had already been there. The anxiety had already been there. Now there was nothing left to distract me from it. Over the next several weeks, I withdrew from almost everyone. Friends invited me out. I made excuses. Family called. I kept conversations short. I didn't want advice. I didn't want sympathy. I just wanted to be left alone. But being alone turned out to be far worse. Because when the distractions disappeared, I was forced to face myself. And I didn't like what I saw. One Friday evening, after another exhausting week, I sat in front of my television and stared at a blank screen. I wasn't watching anything. I wasn't reading anything. I wasn't doing anything. I just sat there, completely numb. That's when a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if this is all life is? What if life is just working, stressing, worrying, losing people, getting older, and eventually dying? The thought hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had been chasing happiness. Yet now, despite achieving many of the things I once wanted, I felt more lost than ever. I remember looking around my apartment, the furniture, the decorations, the expensive gadgets, the clothes, everything I had worked so hard to obtain. And suddenly none of it seemed important. None of it could comfort me. None of it could give me peace. None of it could answer the questions haunting me. That night I barely slept. And the next morning something strange happened. I woke up with an overwhelming urge to go for a walk. The weather was miserable. Dark clouds covered the sky. A cold wind swept through the streets. But I felt compelled to get outside. Without really thinking about it, I put on my coat and started walking. I wandered through parts of London I hadn't visited in years. One street led to another, one turn led to another, until eventually I found myself standing in front of a church. I froze, of all the places to end up. A church. The building looked old, quiet, almost forgotten. For several moments I simply stood there. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Another part wanted to go inside. I felt ridiculous. Why would I go in? I wasn't religious. I hadn't attended church regularly in years. What was I expecting to find? Answers? Peace? A miracle? After several minutes of arguing with myself, I turned around and walked away. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. The following week was even worse. The anxiety intensified, the loneliness deepened, and one evening I experienced another panic attack. This one was different, stronger, more overwhelming. I genuinely believed I was losing control. My heart raced, my hands trembled, my breathing became shallow. The room felt like it was closing in around me. Terrified, I slid down onto the kitchen floor. I remember wrapping my arms around my knees and trying desperately to calm myself. But nothing worked. Every coping strategy failed. Every breathing exercise failed. Every distraction failed. For nearly an hour, I sat there feeling completely helpless. Then something happened that I still struggle to explain. In the middle of all that fear, a memory surfaced. Not a random memory, a specific one. I was 8 years old, sitting beside my mother in church, listening to a verse being read. A verse I hadn't thought about in years. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The words appeared in my mind with incredible clarity, as though someone had spoken them directly into the room. I hadn't read that verse recently. I hadn't heard it recently. Yet there it was, clear as day, again and again. "Come to me. Come to me. Come to me." At first, I tried to ignore it, but the words wouldn't leave. And for the first time in years, my resistance began to crack. I was exhausted, tired of pretending, tired of fighting, tired of carrying everything on my own. The truth was simple. Nothing I had tried was working. Not success, not relationships, not money, not distractions, not achievement. None of it had given me peace. As I sat there on the kitchen floor, tears began rolling down my face. Not because the panic attack was getting worse, but because something inside me finally broke. Years of pride, years of independence, years of trying to control everything, years of running. All of it suddenly felt heavy, unbearably heavy. And for the first time, I admitted something I had spent years denying. I needed help, real help. Not another self-help book, not another motivational video, not another distraction. I needed something deeper, something bigger than myself. The rain hammered against the windows outside. The apartment was dark except for a small light above the stove. And there, alone on the kitchen floor, I did something I never thought I would do. I bowed my head, closed my eyes, and whispered the first genuine prayer I had prayed in years. God. The word felt strange, unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Tears continued running down my face. My voice shook, and slowly the walls around my heart began to fall. What happened next would change my life forever. Because that prayer became the beginning of a journey I never expected. A journey that would lead me from fear to peace, from emptiness to purpose, and from running away from God to finally finding Him. But first, I would have to discover that surrender is often where healing begins. I wish I could tell you that the moment I prayed, a bright light filled the room. I wish I could tell you that all my anxiety instantly disappeared. I wish I could tell you that every problem in my life was solved in a single night. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter, softer, yet somehow far more powerful. Sitting on that kitchen floor, tears streaming down my face, I whispered words I hadn't planned to say. God, I don't even know if you're listening. My voice cracked. I don't know if I've spent years talking to nothing. I paused. The silence in the apartment felt almost overwhelming. Then I continued, but if you're real, if you're really there, I can't do this anymore. More tears came, the kind you can't control, the kind that come from somewhere deep inside. I'm tired. I had never admitted that before, not to anyone, not even to myself. I'm tired of pretending I'm okay. I'm tired of carrying everything by myself. I'm tired of being afraid. And then the words came out before I could stop them. I need you. The moment I said it, I broke down completely. For years, I had built my identity around being strong, independent, self-sufficient, successful. Yet in that moment, none of those things mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely honest. Not with another person, but with God. I stayed there for a long time. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, the tears slowed. The panic attack eased. My breathing became steadier. The fear that had consumed me for hours began losing its grip. And although nothing around me had changed, something inside me had. For the first time in months, I felt a small sense of calm. Not excitement, not overwhelming happiness, just peace. A peace I couldn't explain. The next morning, I woke up expecting to feel embarrassed. I expected to convince myself that the prayer had simply been an emotional reaction. But strangely, I didn't. In fact, I felt different. The problems were still there, Work was still stressful, my relationship was still over, my future was still uncertain. Yet something felt lighter, as though I wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. That feeling stayed with me throughout the day. Then something unexpected happened. During my lunch break, I walked into a bookstore. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply wandering through the aisles. As I turned a corner, my eyes landed on a display table, and sitting directly in the center was a Bible. I laughed quietly to myself. What are the chances? For a moment, I considered walking away, but instead, I picked it up. The cover was simple. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a Bible. I stood there holding it, remembering all the Sundays from my childhood, remembering the faith I had abandoned years earlier. After a few moments, I bought it. Even now, I can't fully explain why. Part of me was curious, part of me was desperate, part of me simply wanted answers. That evening, I opened it for the first time in years. I didn't know where to start. The Bible felt enormous. Thousands of pages, dozens of books, countless stories. So I did something simple. I opened to the Gospel of John, and I started reading. At first, I expected the words to feel distant, outdated, irrelevant. Instead, something surprising happened. The more I read about Jesus, the more fascinated I became, not because he matched the image I had created in my mind, but because he didn't. The Jesus I encountered in those pages wasn't weak. He wasn't boring. He wasn't merely a religious figure. He was compassionate, bold, patient, powerful, and deeply concerned with people who were hurting, especially people who felt lost. People like me. Night after night, I kept reading, sometimes only a few pages, sometimes entire chapters. Questions continued appearing in my mind, but for the first time, I wasn't running from them. I was exploring them. A few weeks later, something else happened. One Sunday morning, I found myself thinking about that church I had walked past. The old one. The one I never entered. The thought stayed with me all morning. By lunchtime, it was impossible to ignore. Finally, I grabbed my coat and headed out. As I approached the building, my heart pounded. Not because I was afraid of the church itself, but because stepping inside felt like crossing a line. It felt like admitting that maybe I didn't have all the answers. For several moments, I stood outside. Then I opened the door. The sanctuary was smaller than I expected. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows. A few people sat quietly talking. No one stared at me. No one pressured me. No one asked uncomfortable questions. I slipped into a seat near the back, hoping nobody would notice me. The service began. There was music, prayer, scripture reading. And then the pastor stood up to speak. I don't remember every detail of his sermon, but I remember one statement clearly. He said, "Many people spend years searching for purpose in success, relationships, achievements, and possessions, but the human heart was created for something greater than those things." The words struck me immediately because they described my life perfectly. For years, I had searched for fulfillment everywhere except God, and none of it had worked. As the service ended, people slowly began leaving. I intended to leave quickly, too. But before I reached the door, an elderly woman smiled at me. "First time here?" she asked kindly. I nodded. She introduced herself and welcomed me. Nothing dramatic, nothing pushy, just kindness. Simple kindness. Yet somehow it meant a lot. Because loneliness had convinced me that nobody cared. That small interaction challenged that belief. Over the following months, I continued attending. Not every week at first, sometimes every other week, sometimes less. But I kept returning, and each time I learned something new. About faith, about grace, about forgiveness, about God. Most importantly, I began learning something about myself. I had spent years believing that God was disappointed in me, angry with me, waiting to punish me for walking away. But the more I read scripture, the more I realized how wrong I had been. Again and again, I encountered stories of people who failed, people who doubted, people who ran, people who made terrible mistakes. Yet God continued pursuing them, not with condemnation, but with love. That realization changed everything. Because if God could still love people like them, maybe he could still love someone like me. One evening, several months after that prayer on the kitchen floor, I was reading a passage that spoke about God's love. As I read, something suddenly became clear. I had spent years trying to earn worth through achievement, trying to prove I mattered, trying to become enough. Yet God wasn't asking me to prove myself. He wasn't asking me to earn his love. He was offering it freely. The realization overwhelmed me. For years, I had been running from faith, running from God, running from questions, running from pain, running from myself, and all along God had been waiting patiently, not forcing me, not abandoning me, simply waiting for me to stop running. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I prayed again, but this prayer was different. This time I wasn't asking whether God was real. This time I was responding. With tears in my eyes, I thanked him for his patience, for his mercy, for never giving up on me, and for meeting me in my darkest moment. What I didn't realize then was that God wasn't finished transforming my life. The greatest lessons were still ahead. Because faith wouldn't remove every challenge. There would still be difficult days, there would still be questions, there would still be struggles. But now I was learning something beautiful. I no longer had to face them alone, and that truth would soon be tested in ways I never expected. When people hear stories like mine, they often assume everything became easy after I returned to God. They imagine that my anxiety disappeared overnight. They imagine that every problem was solved. They imagine that faith instantly transformed my life into a perfect story. The truth is much different. Coming back to God didn't remove every storm. What changed was that I finally had someone to hold on to in the middle of them. And that made all the difference. The months that followed were some of the most important months of my life. Not because everything went smoothly, but because God began changing me from the inside out. For years, I had focused almost entirely on external things: my appearance, my career, my achievements, my social status, my relationships. Everything revolved around how I looked to other people. If people approved of me, I felt valuable. If they didn't, I felt worthless. Without realizing it, I had built my identity on the opinions of strangers. And that foundation was incredibly fragile. The first time I truly noticed this was at work. One morning, after spending days preparing a presentation, I presented my ideas to senior management. The presentation went well. Most people responded positively. But one manager criticized part of my proposal. His feedback wasn't rude. It wasn't even harsh. Yet the moment I heard it, I felt that familiar wave of insecurity. The same insecurity that had followed me for years. The voice inside my head immediately began speaking. You're not good enough. You're failing. People are disappointed in you. You're falling behind. Normally, those thoughts would have controlled me for days. But this time, something different happened. Instead of spiraling into anxiety, I remembered something I had recently read. My value didn't come from my performance. My value didn't come from approval. My value didn't come from success. My value came from God. For the first time, I challenged those negative thoughts instead of believing them. It wasn't easy, but it was the beginning of freedom. Little by little, God was teaching me that my identity was rooted in something far stronger than achievements. At the same time, my prayer life began growing. At first, prayer still felt awkward. Sometimes I didn't know what to say. Sometimes I felt silly speaking into what appeared to be empty space. But I kept praying anyway, not because I had all the answers, but because I was beginning to trust the one I was talking to. I prayed while walking to work. I prayed during lunch breaks. I prayed before bed. Sometimes my prayers were only a few sentences long. Sometimes they lasted much longer. What surprised me most was how personal those conversations became. For years, I had viewed God as distant, a powerful being somewhere far away. Now I was beginning to experience him differently, not as distant, but as present, not as cold, but as loving, not as someone waiting to judge me, but as a father inviting me closer. One evening, while reading scripture, I came across a verse that deeply affected me. It spoke about casting our anxieties upon God because he cares for us. I read it several times. Then I read it again, because the idea seemed almost unbelievable. The creator of the universe cared about my worries, my fears, my struggles, my sleepless nights. Yet the more I reflected on it, the more real it became. And slowly, I started bringing everything to him. Not just the big problems, the small ones too. The fears nobody else knew about, the insecurities I hid behind smiles, the wounds I carried from the past, the disappointments I rarely talked about. Instead of carrying them alone, I began placing them in God's hands. And with each step, I felt lighter. Not because life became perfect, but because I wasn't carrying the burden by myself anymore. Around this time, something else began happening. People started noticing changes in me. At first, I didn't realize it. The changes felt gradual, almost invisible, but others could see them. One afternoon, a colleague approached me during lunch. She looked at me thoughtfully before speaking. "You seem different lately." I smiled. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem calmer." Her comment surprised me, because only a year earlier, calm was the last word anyone would have used to describe me. I laughed softly, then changed the subject. But her words stayed with me. Over the following weeks, several others made similar comments. Friends noticed, family noticed, coworkers noticed, even my mother mentioned it during a phone call. "You sound happier," she said. The truth was that happiness wasn't exactly the right word. What I was experiencing went deeper than happiness. Happiness depends on circumstances. And my circumstances were far from perfect. What I had begun discovering was peace. Real peace. The kind that remains even when life isn't going according to plan. The kind I had spent years searching for in all the wrong places. One weekend, I visited my parents. We spent the afternoon drinking tea in the garden. The weather was beautiful. Birds sang from nearby trees. For the first time in years, I felt fully present. Not distracted by anxiety, not trapped in endless worries about the future, just present. At one point, my father looked at me and asked a question. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated, then smiled. "Have you started going back to church?" For a moment, I stared at him, surprised. I hadn't told my parents much about my journey, not because I was hiding it. I simply wasn't sure how to explain it. Slowly, I nodded. Yes. My father's eyes became emotional. My mother looked down quietly. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then my mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We've been praying for you." Those words hit me harder than I expected, because suddenly I realized something. While I had spent years running from God, others had never stopped praying for me. My parents had prayed, people from my childhood church had prayed, friends had prayed. Even when I wasn't thinking about God, people were faithfully asking Him to guide me. The realization brought tears to my eyes. That evening, after returning to my apartment, I sat quietly thinking about everything that had happened. The panic attacks, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the fear, the questions, the searching. Looking back, I could see God's fingerprints all over my story. Not because every painful event had been good. Some experiences were genuinely difficult, some moments had hurt deeply, but somehow, God had used even those painful seasons to draw me closer to Him. Without the anxiety, I might never have searched for peace. Without the heartbreak, I might never have recognized my deeper emptiness. Without the loneliness, I might never have realized how much I needed Him. For the first time, I understood something that once seemed impossible. God had not abandoned me during my darkest years. He had been with me the entire time, even when I couldn't see Him, even when I ignored Him, even when I doubted Him, even when I ran from Him. That realization filled me with gratitude. But my journey wasn't over. A new challenge was approaching, one that would test whether my faith was real or merely emotional, one that would force me to trust God in a deeper way than ever before. Because sometimes faith grows strongest not after the storm ends, but when another storm suddenly begins. And the news I would receive only a few weeks later would shake me in ways I never expected. Yet it would also reveal just how much God had already transformed my heart. A few weeks after that conversation with my parents, I received news that completely caught me off guard. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk finishing a report when my phone vibrated. It was my mother. Normally, she wouldn't call during work hours unless something was important. The moment I answered, I could hear the concern in her voice. "Your dad's in the hospital." For a second, everything around me seemed to stop. What happened? He collapsed at work. My heart dropped. I grabbed my coat and left immediately. The journey to the hospital felt endless. Every terrible possibility raced through my mind. By the time I arrived, fear had completely taken over. When I finally saw my father, relief washed over me. He was conscious, talking, smiling even. But doctors were still running tests, and no one knew exactly what had caused the collapse. The next few days were difficult. Waiting, uncertainty, fear, questions. The same emotions that once would have completely overwhelmed me. Yet something was different now. Of course I was worried. Of course I was afraid. But underneath the fear was something else. Trust. Not confidence that everything would happen exactly the way I wanted, but confidence that God would remain faithful no matter what happened. For years, circumstances had controlled my emotional state. Good circumstances meant peace. Bad circumstances meant panic. Now, I was learning a different kind of peace. A peace rooted in God's presence rather than my situation. Eventually, doctors discovered that my father's condition was treatable. The recovery process would take time, but he was going to be okay. When we received the news, my mother cried tears of relief. I nearly did too. And standing there in that hospital room, I found myself silently thanking God, not only for my father's recovery, but for how much he had changed me. Because as I looked back over the previous few years, I barely recognized the person I used to be. The old Andriana believed success would save her. The old Andriana believed relationships would complete her. The old Andriana believed money would satisfy her. The old Andriana believed she had to carry every burden alone. But that version of me was gone. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually, patiently, one step at a time. God had transformed me. A few months later, I was invited to share my testimony at church. The idea terrified me. Speaking in front of people had never been my favorite thing, especially when the subject was so personal. Part of me wanted to decline, part of me wanted to stay hidden, but another part knew that God had given me this story for a reason. So I agreed. The evening finally arrived. As I stood behind the microphone looking out at the audience, my hands trembled slightly, not from anxiety, from emotion, because I knew exactly where this journey had begun, on a kitchen floor, in a dark apartment, feeling hopeless, feeling broken, feeling completely alone. I took a deep breath and began speaking. I told them about my childhood, my doubts, my years of running, the anxiety, the panic attacks, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the search for peace, and finally, the prayer that changed everything. As I spoke, I noticed tears in the eyes of several people. Not because my story was extraordinary, but because parts of it sounded like their story. Some were fighting anxiety, some were carrying grief, some were questioning their faith, some were exhausted from trying to control everything. And suddenly I realized something powerful. The details of our stories may be different, but the human heart is often searching for the same things: hope, peace, purpose, love, and ultimately God. When I reached the end of my testimony, I paused for a moment. Then I shared the lesson that had changed my life. I said, "For years, I thought I was running away from God." The room became completely silent. I thought I was leaving him behind. I smiled through tears. But what I eventually discovered is that every step I took away from him, he was still pursuing me with love. My voice shook. He never abandoned me. He never stopped caring. He never stopped calling me back. And when I finally turned around, he was already there. The room remained silent. Many people were crying. Honestly, so was I. After the service ended, several people approached me. Some wanted prayer. Some wanted to share their own stories. Others simply thanked me. One young woman stood in line for nearly 20 minutes just to speak with me. When she finally reached me, tears were streaming down her face. She looked at me and said, "I thought I was the only one." Those words stayed with me because that's exactly how I had felt during my darkest season. Alone, forgotten, different. Yet I wasn't, and neither was she. Years have passed since that night on the kitchen floor. Life is still life. Challenges still come. Difficult days still happen. There are moments when fear tries to return, moments when uncertainty appears, moments when I don't understand what God is doing. But now I face those moments differently. Because my faith is no longer built on circumstances. It's built on the God who remained faithful through every circumstance. Today, when I think about the title of this story, The Day I Stopped Running from God, I realize something important. It wasn't really about one single day. It was a decision, a turning point, a moment when I finally stopped trying to be my own savior. A moment when I admitted that success couldn't save me. Relationships couldn't save me. Money couldn't save me. Achievement couldn't save me. Only God could fill the emptiness I carried for so many years. And if there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, it's this. No matter how far you've wandered, no matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how many doubts you carry, no matter how long you've been running, you are never beyond God's reach. I know that because I spent years trying to outrun him, and I failed. Not because he forced me back, not because he punished me, but because his love was greater than my resistance, greater than my fear, greater than my pride, greater than my doubts, and greater than every mile I tried to put between us. Sometimes people ask me what changed my life. Was it a sermon, a church service, a Bible verse, a prayer? The truth is that all of those things played a role. But if I had to give one answer, it would be this. My life changed the moment I stopped running and finally let God find me. And looking back now, that was the best decision I ever made. The rainstorm that once felt like the end of my story became the beginning of a completely new one. A story of grace, a story of healing, a story of hope, and a story that proves one simple truth. You can run from God for a season. You can ignore him for years. You can doubt him, question him, even walk away from him. But when you finally turn around, you may discover what I discovered. He never stopped waiting. He never stopped loving. And he never stopped calling your name.